Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into what is honestly one of the most famous and, let's be real, most baffling geographical anomalies in the entire New Testament. We're going to track down a centuries-old literary mystery that involves a possessed man, a herd of pigs, and a rather dramatic plunge into the Sea of Galilee.
Seriously, how does a herd of pigs jump off a cliff that is 50 kilometers away? It's a fantastic question, isn't it? If you read the story as it appears in the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Matthew, a herd of pigs rushes down a steep bank and drowns in the lake. But when we actually take a look at the historical topography of the locations mentioned in these texts, we hit a massive physical impossibility. None of the original location names actually make sense from a physical standpoint. So how exactly did early writers and editors handle such a glaring geographical plot hole? Well, let's investigate our first suspect.
Suspect 1. Gerasa and the 50-kilometer marathon. This brings us to the earliest text we have for this event, the Gospel of Mark. Mark places the whole scene in the region of the Gerasenes. But here is the catch, the sheer, unbelievable distance. Gerasa, which is modern-day Jerish in Jordan, is located roughly 50 to 60 kilometers southeast of the Sea of Galilee. It's situated deep inland. We are talking absolutely nowhere near the water.
When you actually map this out, the text essentially creates physical nonsense. Picture this. For this herd of pigs to throw themselves off a cliff into the lake from Gerasa, they would have had to run a 50-kilometer mountain marathon, navigate some incredibly harsh terrain, descend all the way into the Yarmuk River Valley, and only then finally hurl themselves into the water. When we look at this through the lens of historical text criticism, really studying how these ancient texts were composed, it becomes pretty obvious that the author of Mark's Gospel didn't exactly have a GPS for Palestinian geography. They likely just associated the story with Gerasa because it was a prominent, well-known city of the Decapolis, completely disregarding the actual physical distance to the lake.
All right, moving on to Suspect 2, Gadara and the failed cover-up.
This right here is a classic case of ancient editorial damage control. The author of Matthew's Gospel evidently spotted Mark's glaring 50-kilometer error. So to fix the narrative, Matthew steps in and changes the location to the region of the Gadarenes, Gadara. Gadara, which is the site of the modern ruins of Qais, shrinks the distance considerably. Now we're looking at only about 10 kilometers away from the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
This brilliantly illustrates how ancient scribes were actually acting as active editors. You've got Mark's text putting the event at Gerasa, a massive 50 to 60 kilometers away, total geographical error. Then you have Matthew's text swapping it to Gadara, just 10 kilometers away. It is a deliberate editorial attempt to fix the sheer absurdity of the original distance. But, of course, this is where the plot thickens.
Matthew's cover-up still completely failed basic physics. Even though Gadara is significantly closer, it sits up on a high, elevated ridge, and it's separated from the Sea of Galilee by the deep canyon of the Yarmuk River. So the pigs still couldn't have just plunged off a cliff straight into the sea like the text describes. They would have had to stampede 10 kilometers downhill and literally cross an entire river valley first. Matthew's revision definitely softened the absurdity of the distance, sure, but geographically, the scene still lacked basic logic.
Which brings us to Suspect 3, Gergesa and the 3rd century detective. To find a final solution to this whole mess, we have to look to a brilliant detective from the 3rd century. That detective was Origen, a highly influential Christian scholar and text critic. Origen was paying very close attention to these discrepancies. In his commentary on the Gospel of John, he acts almost like a modern CSI investigator analyzing a crime scene. He firmly stated that there are no cliffs dropping straight into the lake in either Gerasa or Gadara. He just called out the geographical flaws in the previous manuscripts, plain and simple.
To actually solve the puzzle, Origen proposed a completely third location, Gergesa, which today is identified with the site of El Corsi. And check out the distance now, 0 kilometers. Gergesa sits directly on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee.
The absolute game changer here is that Gergesa actually features a steep slope that falls right into the water. It perfectly matches the physics of the narrative. No 50-kilometer marathon, no 10-kilometer canyon crossing, just a steep bank and the water. Because this made so much logical sense, Origen's intervention was a huge success. His smoothed-out variant, placing the event in the region of the Gergesenes, was eagerly adopted into several later Byzantine manuscripts.
So let's get to the big reveal. The evolution of ancient texts.
So why does this slightly humorous story of marathon-running biblical pigs actually matter to us today? Well, because this single, tiny geographical detail is basically a masterclass in how ancient texts evolved through successive editorial revisions. It perfectly outlines a three-step process. Step 1, the original narrative contains a massive geographical error. That's Mark's Gerasa. Step 2, a subsequent editor steps in and attempts a logical smoothing of the text. That's Matthew's Gadara, trying his best to fix the distance. Step 3, a later scholar introduces a completely new interpretation to rescue the internal consistency of the text. That's Origen's Gurgisa. We are quite literally watching ancient scribes work over centuries to debug and patch their own documents.
It really makes you stop and think about how we read historical documents, doesn't it? If a geographical plot hole this massive required centuries of quiet editorial fixes to finally make physical sense, it leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. How many other seemingly precise geographical details in our ancient texts were quietly fixed, smoothed over, or entirely relocated by historically minded detectives just like Origen? Definitely something to keep in mind the next time you're reading an ancient manuscript.